Welcome everyone, I have an issue. I have an issue with open source. Specifically, I have an issue with the definition of open source. The concept of open source seems fundamental, but in fact, it's increasingly complex as technology evolves. And I'm sure that if you explore its roots in software, you will find that the concept of openness has been interpreted in different ways. And that's the issue that I have today, because the Open Source Initiative wrote an official blog post stating that the concept of open source is simple. It's binary, in fact. First of all, it's easy to forget that open source as a term hasn't been around forever. In the beginning, there was the free software movement founded by Richard Stallman and the Free Software Foundation. And this movement was very much about the freedom for the user, the freedom to use, to study, to modify and to share the code. However, by the late 90s, a segment of developers and companies felt that the term free software caused confusion. The word free was often interpreted as no cost rather than freedom, so they wanted a term that emphasized the business benefits of this development model. Things like collaboration, faster innovation, wider adoption, and so the term open source was born. While sharing the same core values of the free software, it was more suitable for the companies, for the business world. This brings us to the core of our discussion. The idea of openness itself. This is the blog post that I wanted to discuss. It's a blog post published officially by the Open Source Initiative, and it's titled "There are no degrees of open. Why openness is binary." The article says freedom lies at the heart of open source, and we can all agree with that. But the following sentence is a bit problematic. Freedom by its very nature is binary. You either have it or you don't. Look, even within software, openness isn't a monolithic concept. We see this in the variety of licenses that the Open Source Initiative approves. Take the MIT license, for example. It's very permissive. It basically says you can do whatever you want with this code as long as you include the original copyright notice. It's a very laissez-faire approach to open source. But then you also have the GNU General Public License, the GPL. And the GPL is much more concerned that the freedoms it grants are preserved. It's a copyleft license, meaning that if you modify GPL licensed code and distribute it, then you need to also distribute your modifications under the GPL as well. It's designed to keep the code open. But this is problematic in a software as a service world, and we've seen it. And so new licenses were born. Some are considered open and some not. Take the AGPL, for example. The AGPL is very similar to the GPL, but it was designed specifically to address the use of open source software in a software as a service environment, in a network setting. It ensures that if you're providing a web service with AGPL licensed code, you also have to make your modified source code available to the users of your service. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because you have licenses like the SSPL, the server-side public license. On the surface, it's very similar to the AGPL. It's also designed to prevent companies from taking open source software, running it as a service and not giving back to the community. However, there's a little difference and some extra restrictions that the Open Source Initiative doesn't consider to be in line with the open source definition. So while AGPL is considered open source, SSPL is not, even if they are very similar. This illustrates that even in the realm of software, there are degrees of openness. Licenses represent different points on a spectrum, balancing different values and priorities. Some prioritize maximum freedom for the users, while others prioritize that the community benefits from contributions. If defining open source software was so easy, we wouldn't need to have tens of licenses, tens of different licenses that balances different priorities. We could just have one single license defining if a software is open source or not, based on the 10 open source principles and the core values. And this brings us to AI. The next sentence on the blog post states that software that carries restrictions on usage, modification, redistribution, or access to its building blocks, like data or model weights, isn't partially open. It's not open source at all. So again, this seems simplistic, right? Here, data is, in a very sense, part of the source code. So does open source AI require completely open data? Well, according to the open source AI definition by the Open Source Initiative, data are not required to be open in order to consider the AI model open source. And that's a very problematic point, because some users in the community think that data must be open in order to consider the model open source. There are also ethical concerns if data is private, is not made open, publicly accessible. However, the open source AI definition states that data used for training must not be released as open data. Instead, this blog post states that access to its building blocks, like data, must be granted, or it's not open source at all. So to be clear, I'm not criticizing the open source AI definition, but I'm criticizing the oversimplification that we risk doing in the public debate. This concept of a binary openness is problematic, it's an oversimplification. It goes on by saying that the definition is clear and that it simply asks, does the license grant the freedoms to use, study, modify and share the code? Which again is an oversimplification, because you have to also define what use means. Some licenses require you to do some things when you use the software. Some others requires you to do different things or not doing different things. So there are different nuances, there are different degrees of openness. It's not binary, it's not that this is open, this is not open. There is a spectrum. The article then goes on with an example that I think goes against its interest and instead proves my point. It talks about projects that can look wildly different while still being genuinely open source, like SQLite with no public roadmap and few contributors, and Kubernetes, which is backed by a global foundation with sophisticated governance model, and both are open source. Yes, both are open source. That means that open source is not a one-size-fits-all. There's a huge range, and the same is true for AI. We have small, focused model where we can release also the training data, and we have massive general-purpose model where they cannot simply release data because of ethical concerns or privacy concerns. So the way we define open might need to vary. Look, I think that the work that the Open Source Initiative is doing in trying to define what an open source AI is, it's remarkable. And the work with the open source definition and defining open source licenses and core values and principles, and also advocating for open source, this is all remarkable work, and I love it and I stay with them on that. But I also think this is a very complex issue, and oversimplification simply doesn't help. Open source now it's more than 20 years old, and I think it was born in a completely different world than where we are now, and I think that adding new licenses simply means that the definition slowly evolved. And I think this definition is likely to continue to evolve because the world is evolving around it. So I think that we need a more nuanced discussion on what open source means in a world dominated by hyperscalers and AI. We need to talk about degrees of openness, different kinds of openness. We need to balance the very real benefits of open source with the very real challenges that the real world presents to businesses that try to do open source. And particularly with AI, challenges around data, around ethics, around potential misuse. It's a conversation that we need to have, and it's a conversation that's just beginning.